The raven came at dawn. It bore no seal, only the soft gray feathers of the Vale's mountain birds. Master Lewin would have burned it if he hadn't known better, but the words inside made his fingers tremble. The Eyrie is ready. Lysa will not stand idle. The mountains belong to the north, if you dare take them. A few lines scrawled in an elegant but sharp hand. Lady Stark's sister had finally moved. Robb Stark stood at the head of his war table in River Run, eyes narrowing over the message as Catelyn watched him closely. "My aunt sides with us now?" he asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "Lysa does not do anything unless it serves her purpose," Catelyn replied carefully, her fingers tightening around her shawl. "But she is still an Arryn, and she has not forgotten Jon's death or the Lannisters." "Then we strike," Robb said, without waiting for debate. "The Vale can't stay hidden behind those bloody mountains while the realm burns." The bannermen argued. Lord Karstark wanted more men guarding the twins. The Greatjon barked his approval for war, thumping his fist on the table so hard the goblet spilled wine. But Robb had already made up his mind. Lysa had been silent for too long, hiding behind her son and her fear. Now she offered an opening, and the young wolf was done playing defense. Within 2 weeks, the North and Riverland hosts split. Half moved west toward the Lannisters. The other half, led by Robb himself, turned east, riding hard toward the Bloody Gate. The climb into the Vale was brutal. Narrow mountain passes, cliffs that fell into nothing, and freezing air that made every breath a curse. Horses struggled, men froze. Yet the banners of House Stark flew higher with every mile. They were not stopped, not even once, because, just as she promised, Lysa Arryn opened the gates. And more than that, she gave them knights. When Robb stood beneath the towering white pillars of the Eyrie, he was greeted not by Lysa herself, but by a row of polished knights in full armor, House Arryn's sigils on their cloaks. Sir Vardis Aegean, long thought loyal only to Lysa, bent the knee. "The Vale rides for the North, my lord." It wasn't love for Robb that moved Lysa Arryn. It was fear. Fear of Tywin Lannister. Fear that the South would swallow her mountain stronghold. Fear that her son, delicate and strange as he was, would lose everything. So she backed a wolf and gave him wings. Robb didn't wait. He didn't rest. Within days, he moved from the Eyrie, sweeping down into the southern Vale, with a force no one expected. Robb Stark, the boy king they called him, had knights of the Vale now at his back, hundreds of them. And the Lords Declarant, those proud high-born Vale lords who had always whispered about resisting the Lannisters, suddenly had a reason to act. It was not only a war campaign. It was a political eruption. News reached King's Landing like poison in wine. Cersei slammed goblets. Tyrion drank more than usual. And Tywin Lannister clenched his jaw for the first time in a decade, because now the North had the Riverlands and the Vale, and more importantly, they had paths that led straight into the Westerlands and to Casterly Rock. The war was no longer about the North's secession. It was about revenge. Robb stood at the edge of the Mountains of the Moon, his direwolf pacing beside him, and stared toward the golden fields far beyond. "The Lannisters thought they'd bought silence," he said to Grey Wind, "but now the Eyrie howls with us." The campaign moved faster than any lord expected. The southern lords of the Vale, cautious, proud, and long bound by neutrality, now found themselves forced to choose. Lysa Arryn had opened the Eyrie, and Robb Stark had walked through it not as a guest, but as a commander. Lord Grafton of Gulltown was the first to bend. His port city was too important to lose, and too exposed to survive a siege from Robb's army paired with the Vale Knights. The gold he took from the Lannisters was quickly buried beneath lies and apologies. He offered ships, grain, and men. Robb accepted with a cold nod. He didn't forget which way the banners flew last year. By the time spring winds touched the Vale's lower valleys, the Wolf banners flew over 3 major keeps: Runestone, Redford, and Wickenden. The resistance that did exist came from younger lords, too ambitious or too foolish to understand that the tides had turned. Robb didn't waste time negotiating with them. His war had been built on speed, precision, and fury, and he brought all 3 into the Vale. But every victory carried a shadow. Inside the Eyrie, Lysa Arryn watched from her high perch, fingers clutching her cup tighter each night. She'd given the North what it wanted, but she wasn't at ease. Her son, Robin, barely 12, was more attached to his bird cages than the future of the Vale. He begged her not to let the wolf men frighten the servants. He didn't understand war. He only knew he hated loud noises and strangers. And Lysa had never trusted her sister's children. Not truly. She'd seen too much of Ned and Robb, too much cold strength, too much quiet judgment. And she feared that once he took what he needed, the young wolf would not leave the Vale, not willingly. Power, she knew, always came with teeth. Meanwhile, Robb's war council grew stronger, but more divided. Lord Roose Bolton, ever pale and silent, warned that taking the Vale stretched their forces too far east. The more land we hold, the harder it is to protect. Unless you intend to crown yourself king of the Vale as well, he said in that dead whisper of his. Let the lords have their titles, Robb replied. I want the path, the road into the Crownlands. If we hit them from the east and the west, they'll break. The Vale is loyal now, Catelyn added. But do not mistake obedience for love. They will fear you, and fear fades. Still, Robb pressed forward. He sent scouts beyond the Mountains of the Moon. Targets were marked. Crown loyalists near Harrenhal and Cracklaw Point suddenly found themselves harassed from directions. They thought safe. The Lannisters, focused on the Riverlands and the south, were blindsided. And for the first time, Tywin had to divide his forces. That was Robb's true victory. Not in banners or castles, but in forcing the Great Lion to react. But as the army dug in near the eastern marsh, troubling news reached them. A raven, dust-covered and nearly dead, brought a message from the twins. Walder Frey was demanding answers. He had not forgotten the promises made. His sons grumbled. His daughters, insulted by Robb's marriage to Jane Westerling, were stirring trouble. And worse, whispers said the Lannisters had offered the Freys something more valuable, and a title. Robb crushed the note in his hand. Let him whine, he said. But Catelyn knew better. We've made enemies, she warned, and we just gave them more reason to hate us. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Eyrie, Lysa met secretly with her Mester and Sir Lyn Corbray, one of her most dangerous knights, whose loyalty was bound more to her than to any northern king. She began speaking of balance, of protecting the Vale's independence, and of ensuring her son's legacy. She had let the wolf in, but now she whispered of how to let him back out, one piece at a time. Far below, unaware, Robb Stark stood over his maps, dreaming of red banners burning, of golden lions bleeding on foreign soil. He didn't know the real danger was no longer the Lannisters. It was the mountains behind him. The thunder rolled over the Vale as storms swept across the mountain passes, mud choking the narrow trails and delaying Robb Stark's forces. What had once felt like a swift and righteous campaign began to feel heavy, like a blade dulled by. Too many cuts. The young wolf was far from the north now, stretched between territories, relying on allies whose oaths were spoken with smiles but sealed with poison. But he couldn't afford to slow down. With Goldtown secured, Robb had sent letters to Stannis Baratheon, offering a coordination of strikes from the Vale, while the would-be king pushed from Dragonstone. There was no reply, only silence. And that silence told him more than any answer could. He was alone again. In the war tent, his bannermen debated loudly. Roose Bolton sat silent, listening with that stillness that unsettled even hardened soldiers. Greychun Umber demanded an immediate march into the Crownlands. Sir Brynden Blackfish urged caution. They had not yet secured the loyalty of every southern Vale lord, and too much haste could unravel the hard-won alliance. Then came the second. Raven from the Twins. It didn't ask. It warned. Lord Walder Frey had declared that no Stark rider would pass his bridges. The Freys were withdrawing their support and sealing the crossings behind them. The insult was clear. The Riverlands had been left vulnerable, and Walder now courted the Lions. Robb gripped the table so hard his knuckles went white. He dares. He dares, Roose Bolton cut in softly, because you gave him a reason. He gave you his daughter. You gave him betrayal. Catelyn spoke then, her voice cold. This is my fault. I freed Jaime Lannister. I thought I was buying my daughter's lives. I may have cost us the war. Robb didn't blame her. He couldn't, but the walls were closing in now. And the Vale? It wasn't as loyal as it seemed. Lady Lysa Arryn had begun holding closed. Councils. She claimed it was for her son's safety. She insisted the war had made the Eyrie vulnerable. But in truth, she was drawing lines. She'd begun speaking to the Lannister envoys again, secretly, behind locked doors. She wanted assurance that if the North collapsed, the Vale would remain untouched. And the Lannisters, ever cunning, offered her the one thing she valued more than pride or politics, her son's safety. Robb heard whispers of these councils, but Lysa smiled when questioned. I gave you what no one else did, nephew. I opened my gates. I gave you knights. Do you question my loyalty now? He didn't trust her, but he couldn't afford to call her bluff. Not yet. So Robb planned a new campaign, one meant to shatter the Lannisters' grip on the east. If he could seize Maiden Pool, link it to a naval supply line through Gulltown, and press toward Harrenhal, he could threaten King's Landing from behind. While Tywin remained in the west, and Cersei clung to the capital, Robb would cut them apart. The move was daring. It was also risky. Before he could enact it, disaster struck. A small contingent of scouts, Knights of the Vale, were ambushed near the Fingers. The survivors returned bloodied and shaken. Their attackers wore no colors, but they left something behind, a lion's paw, painted in red, nailed to a tree. It was a message. The Lannisters knew, and they had friends in the Vale. Robb stood before his men that night, addressing them not as a boy, not even as a king, but as a soldier who had seen what victory might cost. They think we're scattered. They think we've overreached. But wolves don't retreat. We hunt. Cheers rang out. But Catelyn stood off to the side, her heart heavy. Because as much as Robb wanted to believe, this was just another battle. She knew what Lysa's silences meant. She had seen her sister lie with a smile too many times. And in the Eyrie, those closed doors and quiet meetings were not preparations for defense. They were planning betrayal. The mountains had given the wolf a path. But now they were beginning to close behind him. The road to Maiden Pool was supposed to be swift. Robb had chosen speed over size. A force of just over 3,000, a mix of Northmen and Vale Knights loyal to the Lord's declarant, marched under cover of night, skirting through hidden passes and coastal roads. The plan was to strike fast, capture the lightly defended, port before the Lannisters could reinforce it, and establish a foothold in the Crown Line's eastern edge. But before the city walls even came into view, everything began to unravel. They were ambushed in the forested lowlands outside Stonehill. It was not a Lannister force that struck them, but Vale Knights. Familiar banners, Redford, Belmore, Waynwood. All of them had sworn loyalty to Robb just weeks ago. The betrayal came like a dagger in the dark. One moment, the marching column was calm. The next, horns blared and steel clashed in chaos. The Knights of the Vale turned mid-ride, cutting down Stark loyalists from behind. Arrows rained down from the ridges. Panic spread like fire. Horses screamed. Men stumbled. And Robb's command tent, hastily raised in a clearing, became a trap. Grey wind tore 3 men apart before a blade sank into his flank. The dire wolf howled, wild and furious, and Robb roared with him, cutting down a knight in Arryn blue before dragging Grey Wind back into the trees. Only a few hundred escaped. They rode until night swallowed the land, and when they stopped, many fell to their knees, too broken to speak. Robb's cloak was torn, his brow bleeding, and his eyes held the fury of a cornered wolf. "The Vale betrayed us," he muttered, more to himself than to his men. "Not all of them," said Sir Brynden Blackfish, riding in, blood on his sword. "The declarants are still holding. But this was Lysa, or someone behind her." Catelyn arrived. A day later. She'd ridden hard from the Eyrie after hearing the rumors. When she dismounted, she didn't ask if the rumors were true. The blood on Robb's armor told her enough. He didn't beat her eyes. "Grey Wind is wounded," he said instead. "We were supposed to take Maiden Pool. Instead, we lost half our strength." Catelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "This was never about the port," she said quietly. "This was about bleeding you." And she was right. In the Eyrie, Lysa Arryn no longer hid behind courtesies. She declared Robb Stark an occupier, a threat to the Vale's sovereignty. Her raven to King's Landing offered peace in exchange for guarantees. A Lannister bride for her son, protection, trade, independence. It was the move of a woman who believed she had broken the wolves back. But Lysa had made one mistake. She thought Robb would retreat, that the boy who once hesitated to execute deserters would beg for another alliance, that fear and loss would humble him. But Robb Stark didn't turn back. He rallied the survivors, sent riders north to the Riverlands for reinforcements, called every favor the Lord's declarant owed him, and then, cold and methodical, he drew up plans, not for another strike at the Lannisters, but for the siege of the Eyrie. "Take thee." "Eyrie?" Sir Edmure gasped when he heard. "That fortress has never fallen. It hasn't faced the north," Robb replied. "And it hasn't faced me." Catelyn watched her son carefully in the days that followed. His voice was calmer now, his rage buried, his commands sharper. But it was what she saw in his eyes that unsettled her most. He had stopped hoping for peace. He wanted vengeance. And, in the mountains that once gave him passage, he would now seek retribution. Snow fell heavy on the high passes as Robb Stark's army wound its way up the treacherous roads that led to the Eyrie. The same mountain trails that once welcomed him now hissed like snakes beneath his boots. Every step up was a challenge. Narrow ridges, freezing winds, and death lurking around each blind corner. But Robb pressed on, grim and unyielding. The siege of the Eyrie had begun. He knew the fortress could not be taken by force. No army had ever stormed its gates. It was too high, too well defended, and built into the very bones of the mountain. But Robb didn't need to storm it. He intended to starve it. He cut off every supply line. The roads to Gulltown were blockaded. Trade from the lowland valleys seized. His men occupied every pass, every path, every crevice that led toward the sky. The lower keeps, the gates of the moon and the Bloody Gate, now bore Stark banners. No bird flew, no grain moved. And within the stone stomach of the Eyrie, Lysa Arryn began to unravel. She sent ravens, first to her bannermen, the ones she hadn't already betrayed. None answered. Then to King's Landing. No reply. The Lannisters had used her treachery and now ignored her. In her desperation, she turned to the one thing she thought might still protect her, her son. Robin must speak to the people. She insisted to Maester Coleman. He is the future of the Vale. They will listen. But Robin was no leader. He cried when thunder shook the tower. He refused to eat unless his mother fed him by hand. And when she tried to dress him in lord's clothes, he screamed and locked himself in the nursery, claiming he saw wolves in the snow. Meanwhile, inside, the siege camps below, Robb was colder than the winds. He spoke little, ate less. He wrote letters by firelight, one to Lady Mormont in Bear Island, calling for reinforcements. One to Tully men near Harrenhal, instructing them to keep pressure on the Lannister flank. But most often, he simply stood at the edge of the ridge, staring up at the distant, unreachable castle carved into stone. He wasn't trying to frighten Lysa anymore. He was waiting for her to break. Inside the Eyrie, the cracks grew deeper. By the day, servants whispered of strange noises in the night, of Lysa wandering the halls barefoot, muttering to herself. She'd begun locking doors, accusing guards of treason, beating the Maester when he suggested rationing the remaining food. Even her most loyal knight, Sir Lyn Corbray, began to pull away. She's lost, he told one of the younger Vale lords. The boy isn't fit to rule, and the woman's mind has slipped down the mountain. We must think of the future. And the future, more and more, began to look like Robb Stark. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into plans. Several knights, even some who had fought against Robb outside Stonehelm, now considered opening the gates. Not out of loyalty, but out of sheer survival. The wolf had outlasted them, and Lysa felt it. She stood alone in the high hall one evening, gazing into the moon door, her breath fogging in the bitter air. Below her, the drop fell thousands of feet, endless, cold, and waiting. They all turn on me, she whispered. Just like Catelyn did. Just like Pettier. She held her son's hand tighter, pulling him close. But I won't let them take you. I won't. The next day, a raven escaped the Eyrie. It was not sent by Lysa, nor any Maester. It carried a single message, written in a soldier's blunt hand. The gates will open. Come before she jumps. Robb read it with no expression. Only gray wind stirred, sniffing the mountain air. He gave the order to march. The wolf was done howling. Now, it would climb out. They climbed in silence. The mountain wind tore through their cloaks, and the snow slapped their faces raw. The narrow path to the Eyrie was steep, too narrow for horses, too treacherous for carts. Only a man and his sword could walk that route. But Robb Stark didn't hesitate. With gray wind at his side and a chosen guard of Northmen and Vale turncoats behind him, he ascended the last of the giant's lance. It took hours. They passed the 3 sky cells carved into the cliff face, some still occupied by half-starved prisoners. The howling wind drowned out the moans. One man screamed curses at them, crying, "She killed the boy. She's mad," before disappearing. Back into the darkness of his cell, Robb didn't flinch. At the top, the moon gate stood open. No resistance, no guards, no greeting. Just cold silence, the kind that sinks in the bones and never leaves. Robb entered the Eyrie alone. He crossed the marbled high hall slowly, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The once bright banners of House Arryn hung limp and dusty. A silver dish of spoiled fruit sat abandoned on a long table. No music, no servants. Just the slow drip of melted snow from the stone ceiling above. And at the far end, by the open moon door, stood Lysa Arryn, clutching her son. Robin's face was pale, streaked with tears. His limbs hung limp, his eyes distant. He looked less like a boy lord and more like a frightened child dragged too far into a world that never wanted him. His mother held him like a doll, tight, desperate. "You shouldn't be here," Lysa said, voice trembling. "This is my home. You have no right." Robb didn't draw his sword. He didn't shout. He simply looked at her, as if waiting for her to finish a lie she wasn't sure she believed. "You betrayed me," he said quietly. "I saved the Vale," she snapped. "From you, from your war, from your pride. I opened my gates to you, and you repaid me with soldiers in my halls and spies in my court." "You opened your gates for yourself," Robb replied, "and then slammed them shut when you thought the lions would feed you better." Lysa's grip on her son tightened. Robin whimpered, and she shook him roughly. They were going to give him a queen, a wife of Lannister blood. Do you know what that would have meant for the Vale? Protection, power, respect. At what cost? Everything. She screamed, stepping dangerously close to the moon door. "But I would have paid it. I would have paid it gladly to keep him safe." Robb took a careful step forward. "Lysa, let the boy go." She shook her head, backing closer to the edge. "He's all I have," she whispered. "My only child. My only future. I lost Petyr. I lost Catelyn. You Starks. You took everything." And in that moment, Robb understood. This wasn't about the Vale, or the war, or even the Lannisters. It was about grief. It was about a woman who had buried too much and broken under the weight of being left behind. "I'm not here to punish you," Robb said, softer now. "I just want to end this." She stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, her arms relaxed. Robin slipped from her grasp, stumbled forward, and collapsed at Robb's feet. Lysa stared at her hands, as if she didn't recognize them, as if they no longer belonged to her. Then, without another word, she stepped backward. For 1 second, Robb lunged, a reflex, not a plan, but he was too far. Lysa Arryn vanished into the open sky, her scream carried away by the winds. Silence returned to the Eyrie. Later that night, Robb sat in the solar firelight dancing across the stone walls. Robb and Arryn, wrapped in furs, lay asleep under Maester Coleman's care. Outside, his men took control of the halls. Lords from the Vale began arriving, pledging themselves anew. Not because they wanted to, because now they were afraid. Catelyn arrived by nightfall. She did not cry. She only placed a hand on her son's shoulder and said nothing, as both of them stared into the fire and listened to the mountain winds howl beyond the castle walls. The Eyrie had fallen, not to sword or flame, but to betrayal, starvation, and madness. And the wolf had claimed another peak. The banners of House Stark now flew over the Eyrie. From the gates of the moon to the snowy peaks above, the Vale bent, not in loyalty, but in silence. The lords who had once backed Lysa now stood with heads bowed and hands folded, offering words of obedience that sounded more like confessions. They weren't fools. They knew a power shift when they saw one. Robb Stark didn't gloat. He took no new titles, claimed no extra lands, and made no fiery speeches. He simply left the moon, door open for 3 days, as a warning. Let the wind carry the message across the mountains. The North remembers, and the Vale would never forget. Robb and Arryn was placed under the guardianship of Maester Coleman and Seer Brynden Blackfish, who'd been given command of the Eyries. Defense. The boy spoke little. He did not ask for his mother. He did not cry. He stared at the walls and muttered about wolves in the wind. Robb did not linger. He had no taste for the eerie quiet of the Eyrie. He returned to the camp below, where messages from the west had piled like snowdrifts. One was from House Tully. Harrenhal had fallen. Again, this time to a Lannister detachment led by Sir Gregor. Cleggan the mountain. Rivers ran red. Small folk were butchered. The castle was taken with fire and fear, and the riverlands trembled. The second raven came from White Arbor. Lady Manderly had intercepted letters from the twins. Walder Frey was inviting Lannister envoys to a wedding. A grand wedding. A peace ceremony, he called it. Lord Edmure Tully was to marry a Frey girl, and the North was asked to attend. Catelyn. Read the letter first, then burn it. It's bait, she said. He wants to trap you. You embarrassed him. Broke your vow. He won't forgive you. Robb stared into the fire. Then he'll do something stupid. You think he'll kill you? I think he'll try. But Roose Bolton, who had returned from Harrenhal with a bruised column of men and dead-eyed silence, said something else. Walder won't act, unless someone powerful promises to clean the blood afterward. Someone like Tywin Lannister. Catelyn flinched. You think they've made a deal? I think they already signed it. The room fell into silence. Then Robb spoke, flat and calm. Good. Catelyn looked at him sharply. Good? They want me at the twins? Let them think I'm coming. Robb, they think I'm still a boy chasing honor. But I've taken the veil, Mother. I've seen what fear can do. If they want a guest, I'll arrive early. Roose tilted his head. You mean to strike them first? No, I mean to make them strike first and catch them in the act. He laid out the plan that night. Northmen disguised as Frey levies. Scouts hiding upriver. Vale knights stationed 2 valleys away, ready to ride. Glover men slipping into. The twins under the guise of cooks and carpenters. If Walder planned treachery, he'd find himself the fool caught in his own trap. But Robb also knew, if this failed, he would not live to try again. The council broke apart that night with faces grim and stomachs tight. And far to the west, in the cold towers of the twins, Walder Frey held a raven from Casterly Rock. Let the Wolf in. We'll pay the butcher's price. The night at the twins came like any other before a wedding, filled with music, forced laughter, and the stench of treachery hiding beneath wine. Robb Stark rode into the Frey Stronghold 3. Days early, cloaked not in pride but calculation. His face bore no joy. He greeted Walder Frey with measured civility, kissed his new Aunt-to-be's hand with rehearsed grace, and handed over the traditional gifts, grain, salt, and meat. And most importantly, trust. Oh, it looked like it. Walder Frey smiled too. Widely. His words were polished, but his eyes were cold. You came, boy. I didn't expect it. Thought you might send your mother again to do your weeping. Robb didn't flinch. I came because you are my bannerman, Lord Frey, and I always keep my word. The old man chuckled, tapping his cane. Do you? Behind the smiles, and toasted cups, the tension was a noose slowly tightening. Catelyn felt it in her bones. The Freys were too quiet. The hall too heavily manned. Too many guards. Too few smiles. Ednir, the groom, was drunk and clueless. And Roslyn, the Frey, girl, was sweet-faced but terrified. The musicians tuned their strings. The doors creaked closed. And then nothing. Not yet, because Robb had moved first. Just hours before the feast, a group of supposed kitchen hands slipped into the wine cellars below the twins. They weren't cooks. They were Manderly men, Northmen loyal to the wolf, cloaked in stolen Frey colors. They overpowered the guards, blocked the stairwells, and set the back passages ablaze with tar. Outside the keep, a low whistle echoed through the reeds. It was returned by another. From the trees surrounding the twins, Vale knights and Glover men surged forward like ghosts, moving fast and silent, cutting down sentries and lighting signal fires. Boats hidden upriver began drifting silently down toward the docks, loaded with steel and fury. And inside the feast hall, just as Lord Walder Frey raised his goblet and grinned, the doors did not lock. They opened. Roose Bolton, seated to Robb's left, had just begun to lean in when Grey Wind's howl split the night, not from the stables, but from inside the walls. The direwolf had been smuggled in with Robb's personal guard, hidden in a haycart beneath salted meat. He tore through a drunken Frey guard in the hallway before slamming into the hall doors with the fury of winter itself. Walder's smile dropped. Robb turned to Roose and said quietly, "Your part ends here." Roose reached for his dagger. He never made it. A blade pierced his throat from behind, wielded by Sir Brynden Blackfish, disguised in Frey armor. Blood sprayed across the table. Screams followed. The music stopped. And then Steel sang. Robb's loyalists sprang into action, Glover men drawing hidden daggers, Manderley warriors leaping from behind wine barrels, Blackfish slashing down through the main table with grim precision. Grey Wind hurled himself onto the dais, tearing into a guard who reached for Robb's back. Catelyn had already drawn her own blade, a small one, but fast, and drove it straight through the eye of a Frey who dared raise his sword toward her. Walder Frey scrambled backward, screaming for his sons, but they were too late. By the time the moon reached its peak, the feast hall of the twins was painted red, not with Stark blood, but Frey. Robb stood over the high table, chest heaving, his sword dripping. Grey Wind lay panting beside him, wounded but alive. Roose Bolton's corpse twitched at his feet, and Walder Frey, the man who had planned the infamous Red Wedding, now knelt before the young wolf, shaking with fury and terror. "You knew," he gasped. "You knew all along." Robb stared at him, coldly. "I knew what kind of man you were." Walder spat at his feet. "You think this will save your war? Tywin will send 10,000 lions." Robb leaned in, eyes dark. "Let him. He can bury them beside you." With a final nod, Catelyn stepped forward and drove a dagger into Walder's heart. It didn't take long for the rest of the Freys to fall. By dawn, the twins belonged to the north. The Red Wedding still happened, but it was theirs who bled this time. And across Westeros, ravens flew carrying a message carved in black ink and sealed with the direwolf sigil of House Stark. The North remembers. The Vale rises. The lion bleeds.